What's up, everybody? My name is Francesco, and today we're going to talk about all of the Hoka shoes that are on the table. We're going to compare and contrast the different models, the different versions within each model, why you would want one over the other, and finally, what my top picks are for each category, whether you want an all-around training shoe, a high mileage run shoe, a race day shoe, a shoe meant for just kind of walking around town, kicking it, right? And then your speed work, interval, shorter run shoe. We're gonna talk all about that in this video. One thing to note is that besides two shoes that are on the table, which are my personal ones, all the rest of these shoes are going straight to Achilles athletes, which means that they're all in kind of different sizes, right? So we might compare a size 8 shoe next to a size 10 shoe, just to keep that in mind, right? So it's not a direct size side-by-side comparison, and I'm going to point out all of those when it's relevant. Finally, if you have any questions, don't forget to leave them in the comments. I'll be answering questions down there, and subscribe for some in-depth specific shoe reviews coming up. I might go a little deeper, right? This is meant as a little more overview comparison. I don't want to have this video be 2 hours long, and so we're going to kind of keep it fast and snappy. But if you have specific questions, drop them in the comments and we might address it in the future. Without further ado, let's get started with the first category. All right, first off, we're going to talk all around running shoes, just kind of general purpose running shoes. Now, before we get started, a little fun fact is that the way I'm keeping these shoes straight, right? Because obviously I'm blind, I don't see the different shoe types and I can't read the boxes. And so I actually made little braille labels, and on the braille label it actually says the model of the shoe, so that way I'm able to talk about each one and I just keep them kind of next to or on top of the boxes, and that's how I keep them straight. So a little fun fact right there. These two shoes are my go-to recommendations to our athletes for just kind of general purpose, right? Like if this is your first pair of Hokas, or you only want one pair of running shoes, you don't want to deal with 17,000 different running shoes, this is what I would recommend. On the left here, we have the Bondis, and on the right here, we have the Cliftons. Now, just as a little aside, each model will have a number next to them, right? The Bondi, 6s, 7s, 8s, whatever it is. A lot of times those numbers result in small differences, but don't actually change the intended purpose of the shoe. So if you find the same shoe, for example, Bondis, in a lower number, so it's like an older version, in most cases, it's still honestly probably totally fine, and you wouldn't even notice a difference if you weren't, made aware of that. And so first we're going to talk Bondis, and on the right here we got Cliftons. Bondis, you'll notice that there's a lot of good padding all around the outside of the shoe. The heel cup is nicely padded, the tongue is nicely padded. If we flip it over, the treads are really nice, not aggressive from a trail perspective, but just good enough that it doesn't matter what kind of conditions you're going to be running in. As long as you're on road, you should be fine. And honestly, even off-road, you're probably pretty fine unless you're going really technical. If we're coming over here to the Cliftons, similar deal, right? Really well padded around the outside, well cushioned. And then the bottom, if you look at the tread, pretty comparable tread, right? Like good directional traction, just generally speaking, great all-around running shoes. If you're going to get one pair of shoes, I would try one of these. Now, the difference in my mind, the biggest difference is in terms of the arch support. So I have kind of lower arches, and so I prefer the Bondis because I find that the Bondis have a bit lower arch support inside of the shoe compared to the Cliftons. So depending on the type of arch that you have, you might favor one versus the other. You won't really know until you put your foot in. But there's a good starting point. One last thing I'll say about the Bondis is that they tend to run a little small. And that's honestly the only Hoka shoes that I would say I get a different size in, right? I'm one size across the board, across all the different Hoka running shoes, except for the Bondis, where I size up one size. All right, these are the all-around running shoes. Let's go to the next picks. All right, next up we have the Mach series. Now the Mach, M-A-C-H series of shoes are meant for more shorter, faster speed runs, right? We're talking interval workouts, we're talking, fast intervals, you wanna be changing pace often. That's where the Machs come in. And this is my recommendation for your second pair of shoes. If you want a second pair, right, you got the Bondis or the Cliftons, you got your all-arounder taken care of. Now you want to do something that's a little thinner of a shoe, a little more responsive. Maybe not, you know, your 20-mile long run shoes, but which you could definitely do with these. But again, not designed for them per se. So here on the table, we have the Mach X's on the left and the Mach 6's on the right. Here on the left are the third pair of Machs that I have. These are the Mach 5s. So we have Mach 5s, Mach X's, Mach 6's, right? So just to kind of demonstrate that earlier reference, we have three different lines or three different, you know, iterations of the same Mach running shoe line. And that's just to kind of demonstrate, right? Like all of these three shoes, these are different, but they kind of serve the same purpose of your shorter interval workout run or, you know, faster paced run. And you'd be happy, honestly, with any of these three. Now, what are the differences? We're going to get into that. The main difference is that the Mach X, if you flip it over, you see that it has a plate on the inside. You hear me tapping on it. This plate is not a carbon plate. It's a composite plate. And it's just kind of there to provide a little more forward propulsion in your fast runs. I'm going to talk about that in a second. These Mach 6's, these are the most recent release in the Mach line. So even though the X, right, X can equate to 10, even though it's a higher number, the X's actually came out before the 6's. The 6's, as of recording this video, June of 2024, the 6's are the most recent in the Mach line. If you flip it over, there's no plate. You know, minimal, there's still some tread and whatnot, but not as much as the first, you know, all-around Bondis or the Cliftons that we discussed. If we check out these 5s, the 5s are probably more similar to the 6's than they are to the 5s, but also, again, just, you know, very foamy, cushy sole, definitely more lower profile than the all-around running shoes, the Bondis or the Cliftons, but still a solid pair. What I would recommend of these three, if you can pick any of the three, are the most recent Mach 6's. I'm not honestly a huge fan of having this carbon plate, or not carbon, but composite plate in the Mach X's. I think the shoes wear out a little faster in the X's versus the 6. And I don't really need a plate in a, you know, shorter kind of interval run training shoe, right? It's not a race shoe. We're going to talk about another plated shoe in a second that isn't meant for race day, but, you know, I see the purpose of it a little more in that. Honestly, I think the X's, I like the idea and the experimentation, but I would personally go with the Mach 6 if I want a faster kind of interval training shoe. All right, we just talked about the three Machs. Let's go to the next one. All right, real quick, before we do that, I pushed all the Machs to the top of the table, but I just want to demonstrate something. If you look at the padding around this Mach 6, it's definitely still well padded, but it's less padded than the original, you know, Cliftons or the Bondis, which are the more kind of robust all-around training shoe, right? Because these are meant for a little bit faster runs. So you notice the tongue especially, it's pretty thin on the tongue, and the right side, left side of the shoe, there's some padding for sure, right? It's not like a carbon-plated racing shoe, but there's definitely less of it than there is on the all-arounders. All right, next up we have these shoes. These are the Skyward X running shoes. Now these, first thing to know right off the bat, I'm gonna put the box off to the side. Let's pull the table off actually. All right, the first thing you wanna know about these shoes is that, look, check how thick this sole is, right? It is a thick shoe. It's gonna pop you up like 5 inches off the ground. Now, the thing to note about that is that this is actually not a race legal shoe, which means you cannot do a normal, you know, road running race with these shoes because the sole of the shoe is actually too thick. Now, the purpose of this shoe is actually meant as a long run, you know, high mileage training shoe, really, really cushiony. And if you look on the inside, there's actually a carbon plate on the inside. And so the purpose of the plate, right, because you can't use it in race day, the purpose of the plate is to actually reduce the impact, which I definitely notice when I'm doing my long runs, right? It's reducing that pounding over 20, 25, whatever the long runs that you're doing week after week, month after month. It's to reduce that impact so that you're able to train more because your legs are less beat up. So I totally agree. I like that. I love the feeling of kind of training in these shoes, especially just the longer runs. I would not do my shorter interval runs in these, right? I'd also kind of not do my just average kind of mid-distance runs because I wouldn't want to wear these shoes out, right? Because again, it does have that carbon plate in it, and anything with a plate will wear out a little faster than if it didn't have one. But just generally really well cushioned, good plate. If you look kind of at the upper, it's going to be actually a little more padded in the tongue than the Machs, right? These have more padding than the Machs, about the same padding around the rest of the shoe. Decent tread if you look at the bottom, right? Decent, kind of comparable to the Machs. And just, yeah, a pretty solid option. I would not get these as your first shoe. Honestly, not even as your second shoe. But if you're looking for a third shoe, this is one model that you should consider, especially if you're doing a lot of long runs and you want to raise your mileage and kind of minimize the pounding on your legs. Check out the Skyward X's. All right, folks, we're getting to the end of it. We're getting through a lot of shoes. So the next up, 2 shoes we got are the 2 carbon-plated racing shoes. These are meant specifically for your race day. They have a carbon plate in each of them, and it's really fast, very minimal in terms of support and cushioning and things like that, but just an all-around really fun ride. Let's check them out. So on the left here, we have the Rocket 2s. These Rocket 2s here, let's flip it over. You'll notice immediately this is the biggest carbon plate I've ever seen in a running shoe. It's an enormous carbon plate, and you can feel it. You're running these, and these will flick you forwards. It keeps you going forward. Really awesome shoe for your kind of shorter to mid-distance races. I like it for the 5K, the 10K, even a half marathon. I like it. If you'll notice, very minimal, right? Thin padding, basically no padding, just top, the tongue, the back of the shoe all around. There's a kind of little line of cushioning around the sides, but very, very minimal, right? This is meant to be as lightweight as possible so that you're the fastest possible on race day. But that also means that you're sacrificing support, right? This does not give you a lot of support. It does not give you a lot of, the more nice, cushy feelings and features that, say, the Bondis or the Cliftons give you. These shoes on the right, the Cielos. Now, one thing to keep in mind, there are different shoes called Cielos in the Hoka line. There's a Cielo Roads, which are not carbon plated, is not, these shoes. There's also a Cielo model meant for the track, these are also not it. These are the Cielo X1s, carbon plated racing shoes. If they're the most expensive version of the Cielos, you're probably looking at the right one. We're going to flip these over. Again, also carbon plate in the bottom, not as like full plated as the Rockets, right? If we can kind of compare them side by side, not as full plated. It has this kind of cutout notch on the side of the shoe. And yeah, similar tread, kind of minimal. It actually gives decent traction, right? Racing shoes are not meant and not really designed for super high traction, because the more traction you have, right, the more heavy the shoe is. But it's actually pretty decent. Like, never really had any concerns of falling or kind of slipping. Flat laces, you'll notice, versus the Rockets have kind of more traditional, like little poofier laces. And just generally an awesome shoe. I've run 2023, I run the Boston Marathon with the Rocket 2s. This past year, 24, I ran the Boston Marathon with the Cielos. Both an awesome experience. If I had to pick one, I'd probably pick the Cielos. But honestly, if you got either one, I think you'd be happy. The Cielos, a little more forgiving on the longer distance. So if you're wanting a shoe and you have the option for both and you're doing marathons, I might steer you towards the Cielo X1s. But honestly, again, either one, I think you'd be happy. All right, and the last pair of shoes we're going to talk about, you'll notice they're a little more beat up, and because these I actually wear almost on a daily basis. These are the Transport GTXs. Now, GTX stands for Gore-Tex, which means these are waterproof, so you can go splashing around in all the puddles and not worry about your feet getting wet. Some of the actual Hoka shoes have Gore-Tex versions. I think the Bondis and Cliftons might have Gore-Tex versions. I'm not sure about that. But yeah, these are the Transport GTXs. I like them because, you know, they're definitely heavy, right? These are probably the heaviest shoes on the table. Not to say that they're heavy, just the heaviest, because they're meant for more kind of just walking around town, you know, daily walking around shoes. But because they're Hokas, you can also run with them, right? So I've probably run, I'd say maybe 50 to 75 miles in these shoes, just on a pinch, right? You go somewhere, you don't want to be wearing running shoes, but you maybe have a run before you get there, or you have a little run planned for afterwards. These are great for that. These laces, they're, you know, the only Hoka shoes that I own that have these, you know, non-traditional laces. They kind of remind me of like triathlon speed laces. They look like they'd be really stretchy. They're not. They're a little stretchy, but it's not like super elastic, which I like. I prefer it this way. You just kind of pull this tab down, and that's how you tighten the shoe. And then you can kind of tuck this top thing into the laces so that they're not bouncing around like crazy when you're walking around. All right, folks, there you have it. That's the overview of some of my most frequently recommended Hoka running shoes to all of our athletes. We talked about all-around training shoes, right? We talked the Bondis, the Cliftons. We talked 3 options on the Mach line for speed runs. We talked the Mach 5s, Mach X's, and Mach 6s. And we talked, if you want a specific shoe just for long runs, we talked about the Skyward X's. We talked 2 shoes for race day, the Rocket 2s and the Cielos. And finally, rounding out this whole table, we're talking the Transport GTXs, which are my, you know, pick for the daily kind of walking around shoe. All right, and to sum up the picks, if I had to pick one shoe from each of the running categories to round out my personal shoe collection, remember your mileage may vary, but these are my favorites. I'd pick the Bondis for all-around training, the Mach 6s for your shorter interval runs, the Skyward X's for the long runs, the Cielo X1s for a carbon-plated race day shoe, and finally the Transport GTXs for just, you know, kicking around town. What's up, everybody? My name... Don't forget to subscribe. If you want to see more comparison reviews, we might go into a little more depth about a specific shoe in the future. So hit subscribe and you'll be notified of any upcoming videos. Hope you all have a wonderful day. Happy running.